Hi and welcome to this video where I want to test whether white ink is better than a white gel pen or an acrylic marker. If you're new to this channel, hi, my name is Ina. If not, welcome back. If you saw my last haul, then you saw that I bought white ink from Winsor Newton. And I mentioned that I wanted to use it to cover black lines using a glass quill or a glass dip pen, whatever you want to call it. Let me show you mine here. This is what it looks like. Mine sparkles nicely, but of course that doesn't matter at all. What's important is the tip, which is ribbed. And that's where the ink flows down. Now I want to find out together with you whether the ink is really better than a Sakura Gelly Roll or a Posca Marker for covering lines or making highlights. I will try this once with the glass quill, but also with a brush. And since I'm already using the brush, I thought I might as well test white gouache paint with it too. Maybe that will be even better than everything else. Who knows? Let's try and find out. I'm testing this first on a black sheet of paper to see what covers best. Then I'll test it on different surfaces as well. I'll just start now with a Sakura Gelly Roll in size 8. And as you can see, it already covers quite well. Then I also have size 10 here, which is basically the same, only the tip is a bit thicker. Next up is the Posca Marker, which is quite a bit thicker than the gel pens, though it also comes in thinner sizes. Now I continue with the white ink. I shake it first because a transparent liquid settles at the top while the pigments sink. I've already tested how the ink behaves with a glass quill, and unfortunately it doesn't flow down as well as other inks. So if I dip it in really well here, you can see that not much ink runs down. The opacity is fine, but of course that always depends on how much you use, since you control the dosage yourself compared to a pen. With regular ink though, you could draw much longer without having to dip into the ink again. Right now, it works somewhat, but whether the ink flows well or not is hard to control with this white ink from Winsor Newton. I'm washing the quill right away because the ink dries very quickly. And since it's acrylic based, it's no longer water soluble. You can scrape it off the glass tip, but it's better to wash it off immediately. Now I'm using the brush. I've got a really small one here. And as you can see, you definitely have more ink available with a single dip into the jar. However, the lines are not as fine, even though the brush is very fine. Finally, I'm also testing the white gouache paint. I should definitely practice writing with a brush, but on a coloring page, you're usually tracing lines rather than letters. Depending on how you use the brush, you can achieve different line thicknesses. Very thin ones, but also thicker ones. That is, of course, the advantage of the brush. It's more flexible. However, the whole thing definitely requires more practice. You can now clearly see that the gel pen and the acrylic marker are very opaque. While for the other two paints, it depends on how much paint you actually get onto the paper. You need to practice the dosage a bit. But you can also definitely apply multiple layers, which is much easier with a brush. Because with a gel pen or acrylic marker, I sometimes have the problem that while applying the second layer, it scratches off the first one. That doesn't happen as easily with a brush. So now I've prepared something else here. I've applied several black stripes with different materials. Because if you want to add highlights, you don't just draw on the paper itself, but on a layer, for example, of watercolor or colored pencil. You might also color a little over the black line if you want to cover it. So you're not just working on the paper. From top to bottom, I have Castle Art Soft Touch, which are wax based, then Castle Arts Gold, which are oil based. Below that, I used watercolor, then a water based marker and an alcohol marker. I'll start again with a gel pen and take the slightly thicker one, size 10. As you can see, it writes very well also on the colored pencils. With the watercolor, though, you notice it doesn't write as well anymore. From experience, I can say that this isn't due to watercolor in general, but it is because the tip is a bit clogged from the colored pencils. On the next color here, it works a bit better again. And it also works very well on the alcohol marker. I'll try again here, but for some reason, it doesn't want to draw well on the watercolor. Normally, it works really well. Okay, let's continue with the Posca marker. You can clearly see that the marker is quite opaque on the colored pencils, but a bit less on the other colors. That's because the wet acrylic paint gets slightly absorbed by the paper. On the colored pencils, the paint sits more on top. I saw on M Color's channel that she likes to use a white colored pencil first and then go over it with a Posca marker. This makes it more opaque because it sits on top of the pencil instead of soaking into the paper. Here I'm also testing the white ink again, first with a glass quill and then with a brush. Again, you can see that the paint is being absorbed by the paper and thus loses some opacity. Now the same thing again with the brush. This time I have more paint on the brush. but you can still see how it dries lighter because it's absorbed into the paper, whereas it sits nicely on top of the colored pencils. I quickly close the little jar before it tips over and then continue with the white gouache paint. Here you can see the same effect again. I try to blend the paint a bit and you can see the black showing through, but you can also see that the underlying color doesn't dissolve and mix with the white. Even on the brush, you can't see any black that has lifted, which means the paint is really being absorbed by the paper. And it's not because the colors mixed. You can clearly say that both the Sakura Gelly Roll and the Posca Marker are really well suited for creating highlights and covering black lines, even if it doesn't always work perfectly in a single layer. The white ink isn't as good in a single layer, but you can definitely apply multiple layers. And with a bit of practice, the gouache paint is also quite suitable. I've already tested everything except for the gouache paint on a coloring book page. The page with the three little pigs in dark fairy tales by Kirby Rosanes. I don't think you can actually see here which smoke cloud lines I covered with which pen or ink. On this large smoke cloud, which has relatively thick black lines along the edges, I used the Posca marker, as I did up here. Down here, however, I used the white ink, and you really can't see a difference, except that the lines are finer, because the Posca marker is thicker. For the white ink, I only used the glass quill. And now I continue with this smoke cloud here, as a demonstration. I only dip the glass quill lightly into the ink to have better control so that the line doesn't become too thick. Especially if you want to make dots, for example in the background, the glass quill would be very suitable, although that is of course also possible with a brush. By the way, I colored the background with water-soluble wax crayons, while the smoke additionally received a layer of colored pencils. This means that in some areas the color is absorbed by the paper more than in others. Especially with a motif like a smoke cloud, I actually find it quite good that the color isn't extremely opaque and also not always 100% even, as it somehow makes the whole thing more realistic. In this case, I prefer the part done with the ink over the one with the Posca marker or the gel pen, because the white there is almost a bit too much for this motif. So, what is my conclusion? With white ink, you can definitely cover black lines and make highlights. Although I had actually hoped that the ink would be a bit more opaque and easier to apply with a glass quill. The advantage is definitely that the tip cannot clog by the abrasion of colored pencils, or dry out like an acrylic marker. Depending on the brush you use, you have the possibility to vary the thickness. And for larger dots, for example, you could also use a cotton swab or something similar. Maybe I'm just trying to sugarcoat the whole thing because I don't want to destroy the hope I had. However, the white ink definitely has its justification for existing. In the future, I will decide depending on the motive whether it's important to me that the white is very opaque or if a less opaque white suits the motive better. Since I don't want to end the video on such a negative note, I tried two more things. I'm starting in Botanicum by Maria Trolle. And here, at the end of the book, I cover the lines of this little leaf with a ladybug. Just like I did in the last video with the gouache paint. I definitely notice that the white ink creates less texture than the gouache paint. But the colored pencils look a bit less vibrant on top of it. Still, this is definitely a way to use the white ink to create a painted look where the lines are only subtly visible. Another option is dots and paint splatters. I prepared the background here with Neocolor tools. This is a page from Mythographic Labyrinth by Joseph Cattenbank. First, I shook the little ink bottle again, so that the ink is mixed well. And now I will place drops on the page with my water brush, and then dip some ink into the drops. In addition, I'm adding a few paint splatters here. Even though my table is already covered in paint spots again, I cover this area a bit. Unfortunately, the water spreads very heavily on this page, which didn't happen in my test. That created a beautiful effect where the edge of the water drops was more opaque white than the center. But even a slightly paler white dot isn't bad. In addition, I'm now dabbing a few extra larger dots here with the brush. For such white dots in the background, I will definitely use this ink again. It works very well, and the ink is relatively opaque here too. If you want the dots to be more even, as I mentioned, the glass quill is also suitable. I let the whole thing dry and then show you the finished result. I had hoped that I could cover the lines really well with the white ink from Winsor Newton and a glass quill. But unfortunately, that didn't work quite as well as I expected. Still, the product can definitely be used well. If you have any other ideas for what I can use the white ink for, feel free to write them in the comments. I hope the video was interesting and helpful for you. See you next time. Bye!